In his book, The Deniers, Urban Renaissance Institute Executive Director Lawrence Solomon talks about prominent scientists who disagree with Al Gore's views on global warming. This event is hosted by the Competitive Enterprise Institute and the Cooler Heads Coalition. It's about 50 minutes.
Okay, let's begin. Welcome. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for C-SPAN to being here today. My name is Myron E. Bell. I work on energy and global warming policies at the Competitive Enterprise Institute here in Washington. It's also my privilege to chair the Cooler Heads Coalition, about which more in a moment. I want to begin by thanking Mark Morano of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee staff for arranging for us to have this room today, and also to thank Senator Inhofe, the ranking Republican, and Chairman Barbara Boxer. The Cooler Heads Coalition is an ad hoc coalition of approximately 24 groups that question the scientific case for global warming alarmism and oppose energy rationing policies. We have done a number of things over the years since being founded in 1997, the year the Kyoto Protocol was negotiated. And I want to just tell you about the resources, the public resources of the coalition. First is the website, globalwarming.org, and I urge you to look at it. And if you go to globalwarming.org, you can see a sign-up sheet to receive the newsletter of the coalition by email almost every week. It's called the Cooler Heads Digest. I was going to bring copies of this week's digest, but some incredible technical difficulties. So my colleague William Yateman's computer, he boasted all week that he'd just gotten a new computer, and as soon as he tried to produce the digest on it, the program wouldn't work. And the other resource of the coalition is this long series of Hill briefings. And we have had many distinguished scientists and economists and experts on almost every aspect of global warming policy over the years. I think today's event is our most unusual. And the reason I say that is because we don't usually offer a briefing opportunity for one of the world's leading environmentalists. In fact, we never have. But we are very fortunate today to have Lawrence Solomon, the author of The Deniers. And I am very proud and pleased that he can be here with us and is going to give a Cooler Heads briefing. He is clearly an outstanding person. He's had an outstanding career really building the environmental movement, and the more I learn about him, the more I respect him. And I have to say, we've never had one of the world's leading environmentalists as a speaker before, but now that I know him and now that I've read his outstanding book, it's highly readable, and many of the speakers that we've had over the years are featured and profiled in the book. But now that I have had a chance to read it and to learn about him, I am going to have a lot more respect for some of the policies. I'm going to listen to him when I need some, when I think that some of the things I read about the environmental movement and I think how, silly or nutty they are, I'm going to consult him first, because I think he is a man who deserves a great deal of consideration. And I also think that he may be, stepping out further than is prudent for him in writing this book, The Deniers. It isn't going to make him any friends because we have established, of course, that there is a consensus on global warming science. But I'm not actually here to introduce him. I'm here to introduce his publisher, Richard Vigilante, of Richard Vigilante Books, who has had an outstanding and incredibly varied career in the conservative movement and in media. And I'm not even going to begin to introduce him. I'm just going to say, welcome, thank you for publishing this book, and thank you, Lawrence Solomon, for being with us today. Please join me in welcoming Richard Vigilante.
Publisher holds the book in front of television camera. I'm not, actually, that was a great introduction to Larry. I'm just going to say one thing, which is that we believe that this book and Larry Solomon, the author of the book, are incredibly important strategic tools in this debate. There aren't that many global warming books that set out to prove their point and then actually succeed. There are a lot of contentious books. There are a lot of alternate theories. There's a lot of debate on the blogosphere. But Larry set out to prove, beyond the shadow of a doubt, one very important point, which is that there is a vigorous debate. And since the leading advocates of global warming alarmism have said again and again and again that there is no serious debate, that there is an absolute scientific consensus, this book speaks directly to their credibility. It is impossible to read this book and not think that, Al Gore, for instance, is a credible witness, right? So this book doesn't prove that global warming is coming or isn't coming. It doesn't prove that the planet, that man is causing it or isn't causing it. But it does prove, beyond a shadow of a doubt, and I use that word prove advisedly, that there is a very, very vigorous debate, and those who deny the debate deserve no credibility. And that's why I think all of you need to make use of the book, and we're happy to facilitate that, and Larry as a strategic tool. So that's all I'm here to do, is to encourage you to do that. And anyone who wants to talk to me about doing that should find me afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard and Myron, for those introductions, and thank you all for coming to this book forum. I've been grateful for a long time to CEI and the Cooler Heads Coalition and Myron, and also to Fred Smith, who isn't here, for the integrity and the tenacity that he and they have shown during this entire global warming debate. Fred isn't here, so I can tell some tales out of school. I first met Fred 25 years ago, not far from here, at a conference sponsored by the American Rivers Association. We, the conference participants, were meeting to save the world's river valleys from development sponsored by the international development agencies such as the World Bank and the multilateral development banks. The conference had the usual suspects. There was Sierra Club and NRDC, Friends of the Earth, Cultural Survival International, among others, including my organization, the Energy Probe, or Probe International from Toronto. And the conference also had one very unusual suspect, and that would be Fred Smith, who shared with us all a concern about the harm that the World Bank was causing around the world. Fred was a force at that conference and very much in tune with us, although I don't recall, I don't believe he actually marched with us on the World Bank headquarters when it came time for that. Now, I suspect that the people who are here represent an atypical audience, in that much of what I describe in my book will not surprise you. Those of you who know the Cooler Heads Coalition already know that there are many credible scientists who dispute the conventional wisdom of Al Gore and the United Nations on climate change. But some things that I found in writing the Deniers might surprise you. In interviewing scientists, I often ask them how many of their scientific peers in their own discipline subscribe to the views of Al Gore and the United Nations. Some said they didn't know. Some said that they thought most of their peers did. But more often, they answered that most scientists in their field rejected the United Nations position on climate change. In some cases, the answer was effectively that all scientists in their field rejected the United Nations position. It also dawned on me that among top scientists, the majority view rejected the consensus that Al Gore and the UN claims exists. Yet the press states over and over again that there is a consensus. They have evidence, too, of this consensus. The 2,000 or 2,500 scientists associated with the UN reports that get issued every 6 years or so with great fanfare. This figure, 2,000 or 2,500 scientists, is the foundation on which the press has been basing its claims that there is a consensus on climate change. We see that time and time again, those figures of 2,000 or 2,500. The press feels that 2,500 scientists can't be wrong. I wondered who exactly those 2,500 scientists were. So to find out, I contacted the Secretariat of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and asked for their names and contact information. The answer that came back was negative. I learned that the names were not public, so I couldn't have them. And I learned that those 2,500 people were reviewers. They weren't endorsers. Those scientists hadn't endorsed anything. They were merely people who had reviewed one or more of the literally hundreds of input studies, background studies. Some of them were important studies, some not, and they all fed into this gigantic maw in the United Nations bureaucratic process. Those scientists all would have reviewed just some small part of the final product, if any at all. They didn't review that final product or endorse it. Their reviews weren't even all favorable. I know that from many sources, including from among some of the scientists that I profiled, who consider the United Nations work a travesty, and who feel that their comments, their reviews, were ignored by the United Nations. So, there is no endorsement by 2,500 top UN scientists. The press has been taken. It's been taken in by a big lie. This big lie has been told to us for 15 years now. In the early 1990s, Al Gore was saying that the science was settled on climate change. He was saying this at the same time that a Greenpeace poll came out showing that the majority of scientists disagreed with Gore. Gore said this 15 years ago, and he's been saying it ever since. And through a coincidence of many factors, the big lie took hold. Temperatures did indeed climb. Dramatic weather did occur. In the background, the public's general concern for the environment became widespread. Also in the background, Gore worked the United Nations system. It paid off big. In the late 1980s, Gore encouraged the United Nations to hold what would become the world's biggest conference on the environment, the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development. And then he encouraged the U.S. to get behind the conference. And that enabled the United Nations General Assembly to endorse it in 1989. Then Gore helped shape the agenda for the conference. And he did wonders in publicizing it. And he even convinced a very reluctant President Bush, the first President Bush, to attend the conference, to be there with the other world leaders to make the conference a success. This was 1992, the date of the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, also known as the Rio Conference. And that's the conference that spawned the Kyoto Protocol a few years later. Gore worked the system, and it paid off big. He got everyone to sing from the same hymn book. An unprecedented number of environmental groups attended Rio. My organization was among them. And that helped give the conference moral authority and helped create a sense of inevitability. an unprecedented number of world leaders attended Rio as well, giving the conference an official stamp and also putting the world's governments on record. And an unprecedented number of media outlets attended to report on this juggernaut. Picture yourself in, or as Al Gore, in the middle of all this. He had believed since his university days that man-made global warming was threatening the planet, and now here was vindication in the form of the world's environmental groups, the world's political leaders, all under the United Nations auspices. They were all there endorsing his view. If you were him, would you not feel vindicated? Might you not believe that you had been right all along, maybe even that you had a mission to fulfill, a mission that was greater than yourself? In that setting, at Rio, the science truly was settled. It's easy to see how Gore's mind would become formed in the belief that there must be no backsliding. No one must question that the science was settled. The science was so clear that man is responsible for climate change that nothing else could be contemplated, not even by the UN's own agency, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The mandate of this agency was and is to investigate man-made climate change. Other causes of climate change, the sun, cosmic forces, or natural phenomena, those were ruled out. No need to look at anything except man-made causes. And with only man-made causes looked at, is it any surprise that only man-made causes were found? This UN environmental bubble explains in part, I believe, how Gore can maintain that credible scientists don't exist in any number. It explains in part why earlier this month on 60 Minutes, when asked by Leslie Stahl about those who deny global warming, he answered, "It's a tiny, tiny minority." It explains how he could have compared those who hold this view to people who believe that the Earth is flat and to people who believe that the moon landing was staged in a movie set in Nevada. It may also explain how he could miss the irony of likening deniers to those who don't believe in space travel. One of those deniers is Michael Griffin, the head of NASA. Another is Habibullah Abdusamatov. He heads research on the Russian half of the International Space Station. A third is Egil Friis Christensen, the head of the Danish National Space Agency. A fourth is Freeman Dyson, one of the best-known scientists on Earth. To further spaceflight, he developed nuclear pulse propulsion for the Orion project. This bubble, I believe, also explains the fervor of belief by Al Gore and others, and their ability, the freedom they feel to act with impunity. The ability to attack anyone regardless of his credentials. Last year, when Michael Griffin, the head of NASA, told National Public Radio that he believes that global warming isn't a problem worth wrestling with, well, he was attacked. You'd think that Griffin was entitled to express his viewpoint. He holds a PhD in aerospace engineering. He holds 5 master's degrees. He's a member of the National Academy of Engineering and the International Academy of Astronautics. He was unanimously confirmed to head NASA by the United States Senate. He oversees the world's single biggest climate research budget, $1.1 billion a year. Yet, no sooner did he express his opinion than he was called an idiot. He was said to be in denial. He was called a fool. And he was called surprisingly naive. He was called either totally clueless or a deep anti-global warming ideologue. And those who berated him included his own employees. That went on for about 2 days, and Griffin then apologized. And the public hasn't heard from him again on the subject. The public also hasn't heard from hundreds of others who don't want to subject themselves to the type of abuse that Griffin faced. I was at a literary function in Toronto last year and happened to sit next to a global warming denier, who's one of Canada's most prominent climate scientists. I asked him over dinner why he had decided to speak up. He paused for a moment and he said, "I was diagnosed with testicular cancer." He decided he didn't want to die a coward, and so he went public. And he described the pressures that confront an academic when they do go public. He became a pariah. His colleagues stopped talking when he entered a room. He was faced with loss of grants for his projects, but not only was he faced with that, so was his entire department, which meant he was threatening the careers of his colleagues. He's now cured of cancer, and he says he regrets that he went public. But only part of him regrets it. I think he's also proud that he's gone public. And I think he's going to have an increasing amount of company among other scientists. My sense is that scientists are increasingly speaking up. And not only are they speaking up, but I feel that they're increasingly becoming firmer in their views. Some, like Claude Allègre, who was perhaps France's best-known scientist, actually reversed their position. At the time of Rio, he was an ardent believer that CO2 represented a mortal danger. He was an organizer. His name was on a petition that with other scientists that decried what man was doing to the planet. But after seeing the decades of science that has come out of the United Nations, he's become convinced that there is no credible scientific case for global warming. The list of so-called deniers now includes the president of the World Federation of Science, who is also Italy's best-known scientist. It includes one of Britain's best-known scientists and one of Germany's best-known scientists. It includes scientists from the world's top research bodies like the Pasteur Institute and the European Space Agency and CERN, which is the European Organization for Nuclear Research. It's a 50-year-old institution that has 20 country members and services half of the world's particle physicists. It includes top climate scientists, legends in the field such as William Gray, who is considered by many the world's foremost authority on the prediction of hurricanes, and Reed Bryson, who's been called the father of scientific climatology and who is the world's most cited climatologist. At some point, possibly quite soon, if climate science doesn't demonstrate a breakthrough capable of impressing scientists, this whole big lie may come crashing down. So, thank you.
Thank you, Lawrence. We're going to have questions. I hope this has whetted your appetite to read this book. It's very readable. It's got a lot of stuff in it. I mean, I know most of the people you discuss or have seen most of them. We've had many of them here as Cooler Heads lecturers, including one who's here today, Fred Singer. But I learned quite a lot that I didn't know as well, so I encourage you all to read the book. Now, just a couple of housekeeping details. I forgot to thank my colleague Julie Walsh for arranging this briefing today. And I also want to say, if you have to leave early, be sure to pick up a book on your way out. If you can stay until after we're finished, then Larry Solomon has agreed to stick around and sign your book if you'd like him to sign it. So, now, questions. We have a microphone, and please use it. Thank you.
Mr. Solomon, I read your book, and it's a wonderful book. My name's Marlo Lewis. I'm also with CEI. And as Myron said, there are many things in the book that were completely new to me, as they were to him. One of the most remarkable parts of the book, I thought, was the discussion of carbon dioxide, which I had assumed was totally settled, that carbon dioxide does accumulate in the atmosphere for 50 to 200 years, and that's why we have to be worried about it. And secondly, that we know for a fact that carbon dioxide levels today are higher than they've ever been in the last 650,000 years. And yet you presented...
Marshall.
Oh, sorry. Okay, thanks. And yet you reviewed the research of some scientists who have challenged these very core premises of the whole IPCC consensus. I'm wondering if you have received any further inquiries from scientists or letters from scientists about this particular part of your book, which I think, as far as raising questions about the consensus, is the most radical that I have seen from any of the so-called skeptics.
No, actually, none of the. I'm in touch with quite a few of the scientists on an ongoing basis. None of them have raised that particular issue. It doesn't seem to be controversial with them.
You said you were there in Rio in '92. What was your feelings then, and how did that change over time to come to be a skeptic?
I personally wasn't there. My people from my organization were there. I think all along we have considered global warming to be a potential threat. We were one of the first organizations in Canada, environmental organizations, to note it as a potential threat. And there are people in our organization who still think that it may be a potential, and I think that there's a possibility that it's a potential threat. It's just that the evidence hasn't been there, and in part, it's the way dissenters are being treated. And it reminded me of the way scientists who dissented from the nuclear conventional wisdom. Our organization does not like nuclear power. We're opposed to nuclear power. And in the 70s, late 70s, there was pretty well a unanimous view that nuclear power was safe, clean, cheap, inevitable, and anyone who spoke out against it was castigated. Scientists were castigated. We remember that period. We spoke out against it at the time. We came to realize that nuclear power was just not economic and not likely to become economic. But the treatment that scientists suffered at the hands of those who wouldn't tolerate any dissent always offended us, and it seems as if the same thing is happening now.
Naomi Oreskes is a professor of the history of science at the University of California in San Diego, and supposedly a serious scholar. She has published and still maintains that there is not only consensus, but there is no disagreement whatsoever with the view of the IPCC that global warming is human-caused. How do you explain this phenomenon on the part of a supposed scholar who presumably should have access to the same information that we all do? Maybe she's even read your book.
Well, I don't know her. I haven't. I actually have been involved with her page on Wikipedia because her page on Wikipedia seemed so outrageous. Several weeks ago, I tried to make corrections to it, and also I tried to make corrections to slanderous comments that were made about Benny Peiser, who has a newsletter. He's a scientist who has a newsletter on climate change. And that has become quite a saga because no sooner did I make a change. Wikipedia, as you all know, is this citizen-managed encyclopedia that in fact has enormous reach. I've seen statistics showing that the majority of high school kids, for example, rely on Wikipedia for their research. So it's an important way of disseminating information. So I decided to make changes to the Wikipedia page to correct the record dealing with Benny Peiser and also dealing with Naomi Oreskes, because her study was described as being uncontroversial. And no sooner did I make the change than it got reversed. And I thought I forgot to save it. I made the change again, it got reversed. And this went on 28 times. And I wrote about it in my column in the National Post. And there's been a large reaction, but I have since heard from quite a few people. And Wikipedia is in effect, it's patrolled by zealots who make sure that any scientist who is on the wrong side of the debate is slandered. I'm quite sure that you do not come across well on the Wikipedia page, not having looked at it. I happened to check CEI's Wikipedia page, and it seems that all you're interested in is taking money from oil companies and tobacco companies.
If you have a follow-up.
This is a follow-up. I think you're quite correct about Wikipedia. There is somebody or some people whose business it is to smear any of us who are skeptical about anthropogenic global warming. In my case, I'm being accused of all kinds of nefarious schemes and connections, and also some really bizarre things on my Wikipedia biography. Apparently it says, I believe that the moons of Mars were constructed by Martians. But it really is kind of trying to paint me out as a wacko.
Yes. I plan to ask you about that because...
No, I don't believe the moons of Mars were made by Martians. And I don't know who put this on there. And I'd like to know, how do I correct the record?
You cannot correct it.
Say again?
You cannot correct the record.
I cannot?
You cannot correct. I have heard since that article that I wrote on Wikipedia, it has been picked up by almost 10,000 blogs. And I have heard from many scientists with stories of their attempts to change their page, to get rid of slander, and utter failure, because it's not just one person. There's an organized, systematic campaign to we don't know if it's well funded. We don't know if it's. They claim it's volunteer, entirely run by volunteers. Some of the emails indicate that may not be the case, and I'll be investigating that. But there's no question that it may be the world's single biggest source of misinformation.
Yeah, but this is really bizarre, to be accused of Martians constructing an artificial moon. Well, anyway.
Let's move on to
I was going to ask you something else, but on Wikipedia, can't somebody sue them someplace, maybe in the United Kingdom, Canada, if not in the United States? Get a bunch of these people who've been slandered, go after them, essentially. Yes, okay. My question is, I had the misfortune of being on in Edmonton, Alberta, to talk about climate change on January the 31st and the 1st of February. And it was the coldest day they'd had in Edmonton for a very long time. So I had no problem making my case that there are many more important things to worry about than climate change. Okay, and but what accounts for the fact that Canadians seem to be, relative to the United States, quite gung-ho on climate change? Given their climate, you'd think that they would be a little bit more welcoming of a more salubrious climate, may I say that?
Well, I think Canadians see themselves as altruists and also as ineffectual. So, so taking a strong moral stance has only good consequences under those circumstances.
A number of questions. Is there anybody over on this side? Okay. Yeah, we have one here, and one there. So, Jacob, why don't you pick one of them, and we'll work our way backwards or forwards.
Several nations have come to the conclusion that climate change is caused by man-made activities and have begun several steps to address that, like cap-and-trade programs. Is there any evidence that cap-and-trade programs are working?
No. Well, cap-and-trade programs may end up working. So far, they've worked out very poorly. But the assumption of most people who promote cap-and-trade, or most people who promote the notion that we should reduce CO2, reduce carbon in the atmosphere, the assumption is that it would be a benign activity, that at worst we would have wasted some money, but it ended up with a cleaner environment. But in fact, Kyoto has emerged as being perhaps the greatest destroyer of the global environment now. My organization has a large third world wing, and it deals at the grassroots with organizations in the third world. And they are up in arms over what the ramifications of Kyoto are for them. Because, for example, when we purchase here a carbon offset, we take a plane flight where we want to shed our guilt for the emissions that are involved with that plane flight. So we might buy a carbon offset. The other half of that transaction is typically the purchase of a carbon sink in the third world. That carbon sink is very often an industrial eucalyptus plantation. Eucalyptus is fast growing. In plantation form, it collects a lot of carbon. It's a very efficient way of removing carbon from the atmosphere. Those to get the land for those eucalyptus plantations, people are being evicted from farmland, which doesn't hold much carbon, and they're being evicted from old-growth forests. So we're seeing the takedown of old-growth forests, the takedown of farmland in the third world, people who are being dispossessed, typically without fair compensation, sometimes without compensation at all. And this is all in aid of solving a problem that may not exist. So the consequences, and that's only one consequence. Another consequence of our rush to implement Kyoto is that we are bringing back large hydro dams. Hydro dams became uneconomic several decades ago. All the good sites were built. The remaining sites were no longer economic. Well, with carbon credits changing the bookkeeping, suddenly large hydro dams are now coming back, and those hydro dams, they can flood. Well, in the case of the Three Gorges Dam, about 2 million people are being flooded from their homes for this dam, which is uneconomic, and it's not helping climate change, or may not be helping climate change, although it's being billed as helping climate change. And then another instance of bad environmental policy being caused by our desire to remove carbon or to switch to non-carbon fuels is a resurgence of nuclear power. And nuclear power has never been economic anywhere. There are a number of environmental risks with it. So we're seeing lots of environmental risks, a lot of real environmental damage, all this to mitigate a problem that may not exist.
Earlier you said that the press has been taken in by a big lie, and I don't disagree with that at all. For example, even the Heartland Institute's conference that they did on this subject back in early March, rather than really using what science was presented there and all the things that were going on there, they used it as a forum to attack us, including Dr. Singer, who was on ABC Evening News or the World News on Sunday. What do you think can be done or should be done to try to turn the tide with the media?
I think what may well, several things may change the public's perception. One is temperatures may be dropping. It was last year. We've seen quite a drop. But I think the role of the third world environmental groups could be key here, because they have interests different than the Western environmental groups. And in terms of having a moral case, I think the third world groups trump the Western environmental groups. And we may see more and more from them.
This is somewhat related in that along the lines of the press kind of getting the story wrong. I haven't read your book, but I'm assuming many of the scientists you talk to make their living by publishing in scientific journals. Is the press not reporting accurately, in your view, what's coming out in the scientific journals, or the scientific journals not reporting or giving fair shrift to the, or fair play to those articles that are being submitted anyway, maybe from the dissenting side? What's your view?
I think both are happening. People are having difficulty getting published, and when they do get published, the press ignores it.
Did the people you talk with, the scientists, say that they're having difficulty and give reasons for it?
Yes.
That the editors of the journals were prejudiced against them, or
That's right.
They demonstrated this?
They're unable to get their studies published. They're even unable to get letters in the scientific journals correcting science that they feel is incorrect.
Larry, I have a couple of questions. First, your book started as a series of columns that you write in the National Post in Canada, and you mention in the book that you have collected a very large number of other deniers since you started writing the column. Are you still writing the column occasionally to bring in profiles of other people that aren't covered in the book?
Yes, I'm planning to. I think I'm up to maybe 39 or 40 columns in this series, and I'm planning to keep it going for a while, but not at the same rate as before.
Right. My second question is, one of the things I've noticed about the people who challenge the consensus publicly rather than in private is that most of them are not like Dick Lindzen. They're not still in their career, and they're not still professors. They're retired. Or in some cases, at the point when they retire, they then announce that they really are skeptical about much of the so-called consensus, and then they become vilified after they no longer have to worry about getting government grants for funding and as you mentioned, funding for their entire departments being jeopardized by not signing on to the bandwagon. Do you think, have you found that to be just a general, that there are a lot more people who are retired who are willing to go public than there are Dick Lindsens and people who are still worried about departmental budgets and so on?
Yes, I think that is the case, although, well, many of the scientists that I dealt with did say that they were concerned about their finances in making this decision. Some had other sources. Some had, say, wives who had an adequate income to support them. But it was always a concern, and I think that's one category are scientists who are so who are retired. And another are scientists who have such a great reputation that they don't worry about what others might think.
Like Freeman Dyson.
Yes.
Now, I have one more question, then we're going to have the final question from R.J. Smith. And that is, one of the things that has struck me is that outsiders have played a role in changing the debate. And I just want to mention that you discussed them briefly in your first chapter. The two most outstanding outsiders who have really changed the debate are Canadians, Ross McKittrick and Steve McIntyre. Steve McIntyre was a businessman who was trained as a statistician and mathematician, and he looked at the hockey stick and said, there's something fishy here. He was not part of the community, and yet he's made a tremendous difference. And by the way, we've had both Steve McIntyre and Ross McKittrick as cooler heads speakers in the past, so you're part of a good group, and I just wanted to mention that. Now, R.J. Smith.
Larry, I'm wondering if you know if anybody anywhere is looking at, to me, what I think is a very intriguing question here, is to how so many seemingly otherwise rational people got wrapped up in this huge monomaniacal craze, believing that man drives climate change on the planet. I mean, perhaps you have to look at books like the Extraordinary Madness of Crowds and how people got involved, whole nations in the tulip craze or the South Sea Island bubble. I mean, a fairly intelligent elementary school student taking a basic course in physical geology or physical geography knows that for millions of years the planet's been characterized by ice ages and then interglacial warmings and ice ages and interglacial warmings, and that's all takes place naturally without man involved at all. I mean, a couple of years ago I was up in Ottawa testifying at your parliament on the Select Committee on Environment, and they started attacking me and CEI because we were destroying the planet because we didn't believe in their theories. And I said to the chairman, I said, aren't you aware of the fact that this very hill where Parliament is sitting, 10,000 years ago, there was a mile of ice on top of this, and suddenly it all disappeared? And are you going to tell me the first natives here were driving around in SUVs or heating their teepees from coal-fired power plants? I mean, this is sort of an insanity. I mean, maybe it takes psychiatry or sociology or psychology to figure out how so many people got trapped into this. But is anybody looking at this that you know of or asking those questions?
It sounds like a great subject for PhD theses. Probably there are a lot of them in the works now.
Good. Hope they come out soon.
That's the last word. Pick up your copy of the book if you want more. It's widely available now this month in bookstores and online. And if you want to do an event with Lawrence Solomon, Sandy Schultz, the publicist for Richard Vigilante Books, is here. Please talk to her. And now please join me in thanking me for thank you for an outstanding presentation.
You've been watching a discussion on the Deniers, the world-renowned scientists who stood up against global warming hysteria, political persecution, and fraud, written by Lawrence Solomon, Executive Director of the Urban Renaissance Institute. For more information, visit urban-renaissance.org.